You always read that he's underrated, the underrated Brian Redman. It's used so frequently you'd think underrated was his first name and Brian his middle name. Where did this idea come from? Who does the rating? What system is used? We'd like to know. Ferrari asked him to drive for them and he turned them down. You'll never get a second chance with Ferrari, people told him. But 4 years later, Ferrari asked again. Brian accepted and proved to be as fast as the team's stars, Ronnie Peterson, Jackie Eakes, and Clay Regazzoni. In 2 years, he won 7 races in the 312, yet they say he was underrated, apparently not by Ferrari. He drove Porsche's fearsome 917, won 5 of 10 races in 1969, and more the following year, driving for John Wyer, paired with the highly touted Seppi Siffert. Brian matched his times. He drove a Chevron in the Springbok Series and won 6 of 6. He drove for Jim Hall and won 3 consecutive Formula 5000 championships, beating the likes of Mario Andretti and Al Unser. He won Sebring for BMW in 1975, and 3 years later he won it again in a Porsche. He drove a Lola T600 for Cook Woods, winning 5 races and the 1981 IMSA Championship. But they say he was underrated. Obviously, they never had to race him. Brian's many wins speak for themselves. He is one of the great drivers of his generation, period. What's more, he achieved it against a backdrop of fear, self-doubt, and frightful pain. First, the fear. He will tell you in all candor that the Porsche 917 terrified him. 235 on the Mulsanne, the car changing lanes without warning, the frames cracking, John Wolfe killed in one. But it should be added that Brian eventually came to grips with the 917 and was fastest of all at the notorious Spa. He also comes from an era where roughly 1 out of every 3 top-line drivers was killed racing, and Brian lived with the constant dread of becoming one of them. Self-doubt. He never doubted his ability, but he was constantly asking himself whether he should be racing at all. And in fact, at one point, Brian took his family to South Africa to run a dealership. As a sort of farewell to the sport, he entered a race, won it, then won 5 more in a row. So much for the dealership. Few drivers have suffered like Brian, who had 3 major accidents. He burned his face in a Porsche at the Targa Florio, had his arm crushed in a terrifying crash at Spa in a Formula One Cooper, and broke his neck at Saint-Jovite when his car got airborne. Each crash put him in the hospital and gave him more than enough time to think about quitting. But as it happens, each crash only worked to strengthen his belief in persistence, his conviction that things will come around if you persevere. He has persevered, and his exploits in vintage car racing have made him deeply respected by everyone. And at age 76, he wins virtually every race he starts. He is at all times accessible, and many of us are privileged to know him as a friend and fellow member of the RRDC. On the whole, luck has been with him. He's been married all these years to the fabulous Marion, and he has an irrepressible sense of humor. He can regale you with his impersonations. And then there's the spoon trick. As we have seen, there are several words that apply to Brian, but there is one that encompasses his raw speed, his qualities as a gentleman, his character-defining persistence and love of the sport. One word summing up the man and his career. One word to replace underrated once and for all. One word, champion.
You know, I'm going to digress a little bit from the usual in that when I was starting out in racing, I would go up and hang out at Carl Haas's racing dealership up in Highland Park, Illinois, because I just couldn't be around racing cars too much. And this is 1973, 74, and occasionally Brian Redman would come in, and I just look up and I thought, my God, it's Brian Redman. I'd seen him race the 917 Porsches, the 908s, Formula 5000 cars, and he was a hero of mine. And later on, it really came to where Brian became a mentor and, frankly, an advocate. I went to a race in 1979 to Mid-Ohio, the first lumberman's race, which was a kind of a Formula Libre. You bring it, you run it. And I showed up with no ride, but I brought my helmet, my uniform, and show up, and Brian says, hey, do you want to co-drive with me? And of course, it didn't take much time to say yes. And we ended up winning the race. I think we won $40,000, which I think outside of Indy was the largest purse in racing at the time. And then, of course, in 1981, we, with Bob Garretts, and Bob's here tonight, I believe. Where is Bob? Did he make it? He's here somewhere. Anyway, Bob and Brian and I won the 81 24 hours. And I remember, I was a young guy trying to make my name, and I wanted to qualify the car, and they said, no, Brian's going to qualify the car. And I said, okay. And Brian qualified like 16th. And I thought, God.
Actually, it was 15th.
15th, sorry. And I thought, 15th? I mean, you got to be kidding me. But, well, I wanted to start the race. No, Brian's going to start the race. Okay. So, Brian was, now we're going to take this race conservatively. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. So I watched Brian start. And I kind of hung around for a while, and I got in the car, and finally, it must have been about midnight, and I'm walking back to this little primitive caravan we had where we supposedly could sleep, and Brian's walking back because he's next up. And he goes, where are we? I said, we're leading. And he promptly gave me a bollocking, as they would say, and I said, I told you we're not to lead. I said, Brian, I haven't passed anybody. They've all fallen out. Which was, in fact, the truth. And we led, 18 hours of that race. And that was certainly by far the biggest race win I ever had, and it was thanks to Brian Redman. Anyway, so that's my personal... So now we get to ask the questions. These are, I kind of feel like Letterman here. I can throw these maybe at some point. But what I find amazing is, and there were a little bit of the shots of that, I read, some of, there was some chapters I read in an article about you, and it's almost as though the race, when you began, you began like in a little Austin, wasn't it, or something like that? They maybe had 50 horsepower, and literally within 3 to 4 years, you were driving a 500 horsepower Lola T70, which I think David mentioned your performance at Mallory Park. But was this... does this just happen, or was this a plan, or did it just kind of, was it one thing led to another?
One thing led to another. It was never planned. Is this working? Yep. Is it working? Yep. No, my whole life has never been planned, and here I am, 76 years later, still going strong. Nothing was planned.
You raced against guys like Denny Holm and Bruce McLaren, and, I just find it amazing that, that here you started out with very little maybe expectation in a very short period, which spoke of obviously your talent. The Bridges, John Bridge. John Bridges was who ran, later on owned Chevron racing cars, which I drove for. Obviously was a big supporter of yours. But it had to have been amazing that here you end up one day getting the offer to drive the Ford GT40 for Wire. Was there a little bit of unrealism to that, or was it like, wow,
Well, it was all, largely down to luck, and sometimes today people ask me, what did you do to keep fit? And I've talked to Dario a couple of times over the last few years about his neck muscles, because these days I find I've a lot of trouble driving cars, that with high grip, that I can't keep my head up. But I follow the Jim Clark, most of you know the name, and Dario certainly will. Jim Clark, the famous Scottish world champion, and I raced with him and against him in 1967 and 8. And in 1968, we were reasonably friendly, and I said, Jimmy, what do you do for exercise? And he said, well, yes, he said, I lift my leg to get into bed at night. So for about 70 years, I've followed his advice.
So
safe is fast.
Safe is fast. So you had the chance. You drove. I want to get a little bit more into the Ferrari story. You drove, and this is what, 67 you drove the F2 car at the Nurburgring?
68, yeah.
68. Yeah. So you drive for Ferrari. First off, that's got to be pretty amazing. I think every race car driver wants to drive for Ferrari. At least I think.
Yeah. Well.
And here you get invited to it. You get there and...
Well, I was invited to drive, to test the Formula 2 car, the Dino, at Modena. So off I go to Modena, and we go to test. And in the lunchtime, Mauro Fagari, Ingegnere Fagari, who I'm sure several people here knew, I'm sure Dan did, and amongst others. So Fagari says to me, Brian, you see over there, under the trees, in the raincoat. I said, yes. He said, this is Signor Ferrari. Of course, what he's really saying is, try harder, go faster. So we go to the Nurburgring South Circuit. The South Circuit was about 5 miles around compared to the 14.5 miles for the main circuit, but it was the same nature. It was twisted, up and down, da-da-da-da. I'd never been there before. But just before the end of practice, qualifying, I came in about 10, 15 minutes from the end. And Fagari says, Brian, why you stop? I said, I've stopped. I said, I've got as fast as I can. He said, Brian, you are in 10th place. Go out and try harder. So I go out and I drive like a maniac. And I come in, I've gone 1/10 of a second faster. So the race comes, and the team leader was Jackie X, the Belgian wonder boy. The young Brussels sprout, as we all called him. So he's leading the race. Behind him is Piers Courage, the English driver, and behind him is Kurt Ahrens, a local expert on the Nürburgring. And I'm behind Kurt, and we're all pretty well together. On about the 5th or 6th lap, I get a stone through my goggles. And of course, the goggles in those days, these were World War II surplus stuff. They're made of celluloid. You could stick your finger through the lens. So this stone comes whistling through and hit my eye, or at least. Anyway, I stop, I throw the goggles off, I drive 4 miles back to the pits, and Fagari says, why you stop? Why you stop? I say, So he goes, it's okay, where are your spare goggles? I didn't have any spare goggles. So he said, take X's. So he gives me X's spare goggles, which were dark green, which were okay in the sunny bits, but they weren't too good under the trees. So I go off now when I'm lost by a fair distance, and I drive like an absolute raving lunatic. And I have not one thought in my head. I'm driving purely on sight and reaction, and I finish 4th overall, and I'm gaining 2 seconds a lap on the leader. But I get back into the hotel, which is the old sport hotel built in the 30s by the people who built the Nürburgring, that is Hitler's troops, and I sit on the bed, and my hand is in my head like this, and I'm almost in tears. I just sat there, and I saw the future. So I go down to, it didn't look too good. We go to dinner. Fagari disappears. He comes back to the dinner. He comes up to me. He says, Brian, I speak with Signor Ferrari. For the rest of the year, you drive a Formula 2, and at the end of the year, in September, the Italian Grand Prix Formula Uno. And I go, no, thank you. He says, no, thank you, what do you mean? And I said, if I drive for Ferrari, I'll be dead by the end of the year.
And yet, 4 years later,
the
call comes, and
During this time in testing at Modena, I go to Maranello to have lunch. Now we're in the lunch area, which is a big room. It's not as big as this, but it's pretty big. It's a bit narrow. It's about the length of this room, and I stand at the door, and over here, at the far end of the room, is Enzo Ferrari. And he stands up and he walks towards me. And immediately, Ingegnere Fagari comes on one side, and Giacomo Calieri, public relations for Ferrari, slightly behind, about a yard behind. They come, and Enzo Ferrari walks towards me and stops like this. And he stands there, and I stand there, and I don't know what to do. He's tall. He's about 6'2". So I look up like this, and I start to raise my hand, and before I could raise it, he shoots out his right hand like this, and he gets hold of my cheek, and he shakes me like this. And then he spoke the only 2 words that he ever spoke to me. Nice boy. So, 4 years later, well, about 4 years later, I made an incredibly stupid decision to retire from racing at the end of 1970. having won the World Sports Car Championship in '68 with John Wyer in the GT40, '69 with Porsche, the factory 908s, and '70 with the factory Porsche team, now run by John Wyer. And so all my friends were being killed, and I said to Marion, I said, oh, you know, I'm going to get killed. They're all being killed. So and I'd been offered a job in 1968 by a guy called Franz Richter in Johannesburg, and he was the BMW he was the BMW dealer. And so I said to Marion in about September of 1970, I said, I'm going to get killed, we're going to take that job in South Africa, we're going. And we went. It didn't work out, and 4 months later, we brought everything back. We shipped the whole of the household furniture, the car, the children, my wife, everything. Now, we reverse it all and we go back. But I don't have a drive. So I took a one-off drive for the Formula 5000 car. But at the end of the year, Sid Taylor, who was a well-known British entrant, he entered Denny Hume in a lot of races and was very successful. He borrowed a BRM Can-Am car from BRM, and that had been funded by George Eaton, the Canadian stores millionaire. He'd paid for the car to be built. And we go to Imola in Italy, and it's pouring with rain. And this Can-Am BRM was designed by Tony Southgate, who was a great designer, and all his cars were good in the rain. And I managed to lap the entire field, and the field included a factory Ferrari. So Fugari came to me, and he said, Brian, what are you doing next year? And so now I had to drive with Ferrari. So we won the World Championship again in '72 with Ferrari. Just missed it in '73. And so, you know, by pure good chance, at the end of '71, when things looked really grim, suddenly I was back full-time, you know, and having a great time.
So, yeah. I don't know if you might be the only driver that said no to Ferrari and actually got back into the fold.
That's what Fugari said.
Yeah. But you had so much success in the Porsche, in the 908s, 1969, 1970 with the 917s. But when the 917 was first coming along, you were telling me one time that one day you got a call from Porsche asking you to come test the 917. Yeah, I'll leave the rest to you, but I love this story.
This is 1969, and I think you have to remember that Porsche at that time, only about half their business was building cars. The other half was doing experimental for all other manufacturers. And so the facility wasn't really so huge. But behind it all, on the racing side, was Ferdinand Piëch, who today is Dr. Ferdinand Piëch, and he was the racing manager. And then talk about an incredible dynamo of a person. Because what happened was, in Europe, as you may imagine, when the Americans with their giant big block Fords won Le Mans in 1966 and 7 with the Mark IIs and Mark IVs, the Europeans were absolutely aghast. What are they going to do? They didn't have any big engines like that. They're all small engines. So they changed the rules. They're very good at doing that. And so, in 1967, they said, no more unlimited capacity. If you have a prototype, the maximum capacity for the engine is 3 litres. Now, that's a bit of a change from 7 litres, isn't it? But they said, because they wanted to attract more manufacturers into the series, they said, if you build 50 cars, then you can have a 5-litre engine. This would be Jaguar, Aston Martin, Lamborghini, etc., etc. Well, when nobody was really bringing any of these 5-litre cars, they changed the rules again. And they changed it from 50 cars to 25. Immediately, Porsche set in and built 25, actually 4.5-litre 917s. And they were really a replica, a copy of the 908 Longtail. And so the same construction exactly, everything was the same. Many parts from the 12-cylinder 917 engine were the same as the 908 8-cylinder engine. And so quickly this 917 built in a hurry with a big powerful engine became something of a bête noire, you know, in the racing drivers world. Well, at that time, 1969 was the first time Porsche ever had a chance to win the World Sports Car Championship because of this change in the rules. Ferdinand Piëch had seen this. He'd gone into full attack with the 908s, and he'd assembled an enormous team of 10 drivers, 6 Germans, 3 English, Richard Atwood, Vic Elford and myself, and 1 Swiss, Joe Sifford. And so it's an enormous team, and in March of 1969, Porsche showed to the FIA 25 917s, all lined up and all capable of starting. An amazing achievement at that time. But, of course, you know, driving them was another thing. And so when they ring me for ISOC in March of 1969, Herr Redman, you will come and test a new 917. I thought, why do they want me when they've got 6 German heroes near Stuttgart? Ready to die for the fatherland. So I called back and I said, I'm terribly sorry, I can't make it. So Kurt Ahrens tested the first car, and they went to Wolfsburg, the Volkswagen test track, where it aquaplaned off the track and went under the Armco barrier and broke in half and went down the track with the Kurt strapped in the back half. So anyway, eventually, after much work, after an enormous amount of work, the 917 became absolutely dominant. In 1970 and 71, there was absolutely nothing to touch it. It was an amazing achievement. And then, of course, the FIA changed the rules again. They banned 5-litre cars from then on, from 1972. That's why Ferrari came in with the 312 PB, which was a modified Formula One car. It was the Formula One engine, gearbox, brakes, wheels, etc., with a sports car body. So that's how that all came about. So.
Very interesting. Now, you've said that that winning the 75 12-hour Sebring, 76 Daytona 24 with the BMW, that those, I mean, of all the races you won, you said those were 2 of the most significant. And what made those so significant in your mind?
That was, you know, that 1975 Sebring 12-hour win. This was the first race for BMW Motorsport, the new motorsport, and it was a major attack, a major factory attack on the series. And so we arrive at Sebring, we don't know much about it. The drivers, I had Alan Moffat, the Australian, as a co-driver, and young Hans Stuck had Sam Posey as a co-driver. So before the race, Jochen Nierposch, a member of the board of BMW, gets us together, and he says, Hans, he said, you will go out and break the Porsches. So Hans, as instructed, goes out and breaks the top 2 running 911 RSRs. And he said, Brian, you will take care and win the race. And that's actually what happened. And I mean, towards the end of the race, we had about a 4 or 5 lap lead, but the battery went down. So now I'm driving with no lights except past the pits where I turn the lights on, because I don't want to get black flagged, you know, for no light. So have a quick look at the gauges as I go past the pits, and the rear axle temperature gauge was off the clock. So I slowed right down. I'm crawling around, and every lap I'm watching the gap, you know, come down to the second car. But in fact, it held on and we won. It was a rear axle pinion bearing had gone. It was broken in, so the car could have gone out at any time. Fantastic. So at Daytona, again, really fantastic. We had some problems with my co-driver, Peter Gregg, but anyway, problems with water in the fuel. We went on to 5 cylinders at 4 in the morning, and now we drive this CSL BMW on 5 cylinders, absolutely flat out, using 9,000 RPM, and on 5 cylinders it was faster than any other car in the field. It was fantastic. They were amazing cars. And in 1976, we went to Le Mans, and they had what they called the art car. And we had a car painted by Frank Stella, the famous artist. And it was turbocharged. Well, we'd never seen this turbocharged CSL before. Anyway, off we go. And we go through 4 engines in practice. So they put one of the least damage back in, and Nierposch says to me, he gave me the finest instructions I've ever had for a 24-hour race. He said, Brian, drive as fast as possible. It will not last. So we're flat out for 2 hours. It was fantastic. So about 10, 12 years ago, I saw Martin Braungart, the head engineer for BMW at Mid-Ohio at an IndyCar race, and we're talking about the turbo CSL at Le Mans in 1976. Then he says, Brian, you know how much was the power? I said, yes, 750 horsepower. He goes, "That is what we tell the drivers." Actually, 950. So, anyway, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah. You know, I think you know, your record on the circuit, on the track, is well known. But I think there's a side of you that a lot of people don't know. And it was interesting. I saw Kathy Rude here tonight. And for those of you who know, Kathy was a driver in the 80s and what have you, and she was pretty hurt in an IMSA race at Brainerd up in Minnesota in a 935 Porsche. And you did a lot for her in helping her and really cajoling the organizations, the sanctioning bodies, to really do something about drivers, whether it was NASCAR or whoever. I don't know if many people know that. And then, of course, maybe the natural progression of that was when you drove for Vasek Polak, you know, very famous Porsche dealer here in the United States, and really the depository. I mean, this, you know, the amount of Porsche racing parts he had was legendary. And yet, when he passed away, you were asked to be, in effect, the executor of his charitable givings. And so you've had a strong relationship here in Southern California, including some, entities here in Long Beach, I think.
Well, Vasek Polak, as most of you will know the name. Is Alwyn Springer here tonight? Is that who's coming? Maybe he's not. But Vasek Polak was absolutely an unbelievable person. And he came to America 40 years old, not speaking a word of English. And when he died at age 82, following a car accident in Regensburg in Germany, as a Porsche dealer, if you were a dealer, you could collect an extra car from your normal allocation if you went to the factory, and that's what he'd done. At age 82, he'd gone to the factory, he got a car, he didn't believe in wearing seatbelts, and he lost control of the car at 120 miles an hour and was very badly injured. I actually went to see him in Regensburg. He couldn't speak, he was on life support, and he died on the way back to America in a hospital plane. But in his life, he built up this astonishing collection of Porsche parts, 917, 908, and everything else, and a lot of BMW parts as well. And so he was the most amazing guy. And his two trustees, Sam Menzelos and Dreffy Bucher, were his accountant and his attorney. And after he died, I became actually the advisor to his trustees on the disposal of the cars and parts, which brought something like $9 million. But all of Vasek's money went to cancer research. His second wife, Anna Maria, had died of breast cancer. And so before Vasek died, he'd already set up a breast cancer research in the Torrance Memorial Hospital, very close to here, and also in Prague in Czechoslovakia, where he came from. And after his death, his two trustees carried that on amazingly well. And right here in Long Beach, there's a children's clinic, which is superbly organized, and Vasek, the trustees, gave $1 million to that. 2 years ago, they gave $1 million to an indigent person's clinic in Hawthorne, California, not too far from here. And if you're ill and you go to the clinic in Hawthorne, the most you can spend on whatever your problem is $55. So all of Vasek's money, more than $20 million, was given away to incredibly good causes. So, yeah.
Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. Now, we're going to have someone come up here briefly, but there's one more question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, you were the king of Formula 5000 in this country. As it was mentioned by Sam, beating Andretti, Unser, Scheckter, I mean, you name it. You, according to David, could have become world champion in Formula One, had you wished. Did you ever have an inclination or an offer to do IndyCar racing?
Well, I did, but you know, the trouble was I was never terribly ambitious. I never really wanted to be Indy champion or any other champion. I just wanted to drive the cars and enjoy at that time living in England. I had a farm with Hereford cattle and sheep that were Marions, and I fox hunted on horseback all through the winter, and I had a wonderful life until the accident in 1977. But in 1974, when USAC joined in with the SCCA, and of course the Formula 5000 series then took off big time, because now we got Mario Andretti, Al Unser, Bobby Unser, Gordon Johncock, Johnny Rutherford, and a bunch of other USAC guys in this road racing. But what happened then was I had an offer of a Indy drive in 74, but I saw how all these guys that had come out of Indy, except for Mario, were all really struggling. You know, this was a new form of racing for them, and they didn't take to it just like that. And I thought, I don't want to spend a year, you know, in IndyCar racing trying to figure out how it all works. And then I got another offer in 77, just before the Saint-Gervais accident. And the week later, I was due to test at Indy. But of course, that never happened. I mean, in that accident at Saint-Gervais, there was a brand new car. It was a new single-seater. It was a promotion, really, by the SCCA. Because in the past, Can-Am had been a big name. But by 1974, Can-Am was dead. And so in 77, the end of 77, the SCCA said, we're going to have a new series and call it Can-Am. You can bring your single-seat Formula 5000 cars and put bodywork on them, and we'll call it Can-Am. So that's how we came to be at Saint-Gervais for the first race. And I go out, and of course the car has been tested at Midland, Texas by Francois, the test driver and engine builder for Jim Hall for Chaparral Cars. And the car was extremely good. I mean, we were like 3 seconds faster than anybody. And I come in the pits, and Jim said, how is it? I said, it's good. He said, what do you want? I didn't really want anything. I said, take 1/4 of an inch off the front wing. You know, reduce the downforce on the front a bit. Well, next lap at about 165, it took off. It went straight in the air, 40 feet, turned over, came down upside down, and that broke my neck, C1, smashed my shoulder, split my breastbone, broke my ribs. The good news was, as it rolled off the track upside down, as it skidded off the track, there was a rise and it landed on its wheels. And that meant that the track doctor, who was a heart expert, managed to get my heart going again. So that was the first bit of good news. The second bit was that the ambulance blew a tyre on the way to hospital. So the headline in the Montreal paper, when Marion arrived the next day, it was a photograph of the ambulance, and it showed the 2 guys working diligently on the wheel. And me in the back, the doors were open, not looking too great, and the headline was Redman A. Moore, Redman is dead. Anyway, no.
Well, luckily that was...
You know, going back, I mean, Jim Hall, where is he? Where's Jim?
Jim's there.
All right, Jim. But Jim, you know, those 4 years with Chaparral and Carl Haas and Jim Hall and Francois, Troy Rogers, Davey Evans and Troy Rogers were fantastic years. This was the team. Talk about, you know, the best team. We were the best team. That was it. That's why Mario, you know, was fast, brilliantly fast. But he broke. You know, he broke, and we never broke in 4 years when the Chevy racing engine at that time wasn't so reliable. We had 1 engine failure. That was in practice. We had 1 suspension failure at Road America, and that was in practice. So, boy, what a great team, and the work that the team and Jim put into it. Jim was there with the guys non-stop. And I'd go to Rattlesnake Raceway and I'd drive a bit, but not so much, you know. But one year I go and we go back to the house. I'm staying at Jim's house, and he's got this house out in the country, and it's got a big fence around it. And coming bounding up to the fence are these 2 giant German dogs, Rottweilers, I think. So the electric door opens, and in we go, and we drive to the front door, and Jim sits there a minute, and he says, Brian, he says, you better stay in the car. He said, the bitch is okay, but I don't trust the dog. So...
Well, I think oh, wait a minute, there's more.
So the next morning, Jim says, let's go out and fly the helicopter. Well, he built model airplanes as a hobby, and he got this huge radio-controlled helicopter. So he lifts the trunk of the car, and we put the helicopter in, and he forgets something in the house, and he goes in the house, and whilst he's in the house, I feel this sort of thing on my hand, you know, so I glance down, and the dog has got my hand in his mouth. And I shout, Jim. So he comes out, he said, don't move. I said, anyway, it was all right. The dog must have liked me because it didn't bite my hand off.
Well, that's a great segue. Jim, would you come up and join us? Jim Hall. Now, you can tell us if that story's true or not, number one. But you know, last year when we honored Jim, I think the question was, who was the best race car driver you ever worked with? And without equivocation, he said Brian Redman. So I think that says a lot.
We shouldn't say that because one of his other great drivers is sitting right here.
Brian, hey, congratulations, bud.
Thank you.
Have a seat.
So you've told all the stories.
No.
And we had a wonderful time. I'll tell you, that was a great series. And as Brian said, we had some really good guys. Franz and Troy and Davey. Boy, they worked hard. And we had awful good luck. And I want to tell you that this guy knows how to win races. He knows when to go fast. He knows how to win championships. And by God, if he had to do it, he could outdrive any of them. I guarantee you he could do it. So,
Yeah.
One thing that he hasn't showed you that I think he ought to show you is the spoon trick.
Well, there you go. We're going to have to.
The spoon trick. Well, let's have a spoon trick challenge here tonight. Do you all have spoons?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me give you some of the secrets to the good spoon hanging. First is wipe your nose. Second, wipe the spoon. Further. And next, breathe on it heavily. And then, no, you can feel it's got no friction. No, it's not a good spoon.
Oh, almost.
Close. Oh, it's a bad spoon.
There you go.
There.
Hey, there we go.
Hey.
Both my daughters can do that.
Well, thanks for coming up, Jim. And please stay with us for a moment.
There you go.
A champion never gives up.
Boy, isn't that the truth?